Well, it looks like these myths are ancient history. A myth is either a traditional story from ancient times that we develop to try to explain some kind of natural or social phenomenon. Oftentimes this involves the belief in supernatural forces. But a myth can also simply just be a widely held false belief, and psychology has tons of its own myths, which are propagated throughout society, largely because of the media. In my opinion, Hollywood should really be more responsible about the kind of material it puts out there, because it makes people just believe things that simply are not true. Like, the science clearly shows these things are false, but for some reason we still keep talking about it. So it's not really pseudoscience, because nobody's actually going out there and claiming these kinds of things. It's just commonly believed, things about human behavior or the brain. One of the ones that I hear the most, and is really irritating to me personally, is this belief that we only use 10% of our brains. So the claim is basically that we have all this untapped potential. The vast majority of what humans can do cognitively is simply never used. Well, that's completely false. We use all of our brains. If you think of it from an evolutionary perspective, it would make no sense whatsoever to have 90% of the stuff we're carrying around up here do nothing. It just, no matter how you look at it, it just doesn't make sense. So this is definitely, false. But you might wonder, where does this even come from? Well, this quote has been misattributed to many different people, but this quote is actually misunderstanding. It's like a misquote of a famous historical figure in psychology. So the most likely source would be William James, who once said that the average man develops only about 10% of his latent mental ability. So he wasn't talking about parts of the brain. He wasn't talking about brain cells or anything like that. He's just basically saying, most people don't develop their skills as much as they could. Another common myth in psychology is that subliminal messages can affect your subconscious mind without your awareness. So hiding a message in a picture or a song can then influence people in ways that they would never understand. Well, this is mostly false. There's a little nugget of truth here. So in order for any kind of stimulus to affect you, whether it's words or sounds or smells, in order for any stimulus to affect you, you have to be able to detect it. So, in other words, if you don't know it's there, it's not going to affect you, to put it simply. But stimuli that you do detect, so things that you do become aware of, they can affect you in ways you don't fully realize. I'll go into more detail about this later on. When we get to talking about memory, I'll bring up the topic of priming, which is what I'm talking about here. So priming is one way that you can kind of trigger these subconscious feelings and perceptions without the person being fully aware of what's going on. Another common myth is that autism is on the rise. So autism rates are becoming higher and higher almost every year. The whole claim here is that children are becoming autistic at higher rates, and there's also a secondary claim that because the reason why children are becoming autistic at higher rates is because of harmful environmental factors. Maybe it's something in the water, maybe it's something in the food, or maybe it's vaccines, for example. Unfortunately for people who argue these things, autism is not on the rise. This is completely false. So yes, if you look at the rates of diagnosed autism, yes, it is increasing. But there's a reason for that. The reason is that we've changed our diagnostic criteria for autism, which makes it just easier to diagnose a child with autism. In other words, children are just being diagnosed more frequently, the amount of children showing these symptoms has not really changed. Another myth is revolving around electroshock therapy or electroconvulsive therapy. This is a kind of therapy that psychiatrists use that looks a lot like torture. So the whole claim here is that psychiatric doctors use electroshock machines to punish disorderly patients. This should seem, while this might seem appealing, this is obviously completely false. A psychiatric doctor would not be able to remain a psychiatric doctor if they're going around shocking people. What they're actually doing here, what electroconvulsive therapy is actually all about, is that it can actually be used very effectively to treat severe depression. So people with such severe depression where they don't want to do anything, don't want to even get out of bed, don't even want to eat, don't even want to talk, just completely disabling depression. Electroconvulsive therapy has been proven time and time again to help them and to enable them to live a normal life again. How exactly it does this isn't fully understood, but it is clearly an effective treatment for severe depression. Another myth propagated by Hollywood is the whole idea that catharsis can help you. So catharsis is just this idea that if you have a lot of emotions, like if you have a lot of anger, it's better to express those emotions, to let out that anger, than to kind of bottle them up and keep them to yourself. This is mostly false. Expressing your emotions in many cases can actually make them stronger. Like if you start screaming, if you start shouting and flailing your hands because you're really angry, those things you're doing are actually going to feed back into your body and make you even more upset in some cases. Also, the emotions you display can affect other people's emotions. So let's say you're really angry and you start screaming at somebody, well, that person's going to also get angry and scream back at you, and it's just like an echo chamber, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. However, expressing your emotions in certain ways can calm you down. Like if you're really angry, a good way to calm down is to take out that anger in the form of like physical exercise. So make your body physically tired, and you will deplete those hormones, those anger hormones, which will allow you to calm down. But all this stuff, all this belief that expressing your anger is better than holding it in, this all can be traced back to Sigmund Freud's theories. And in this video series, I've already mentioned that Freud was no scientist, so there's no scientific evidence for this catharsis. Another myth that unfortunately has had a major impact on our educational system here in the US is this idea that having a low self-esteem will cause you to do poorly in life. Like you might even say, how's that a myth? That's clearly true. Well, think of it this way. The claim is that having a low self-esteem will cause you to do poorly in life, when it could also be equally likely, if not more likely, that doing poorly in life causes you to have low self-esteem. In reality, that's what's actually going on. So yeah, I mean, you have to be mentally healthy in order to do well in life. But we shouldn't simply be teaching children to have a high self-esteem. Like if you teach a child to feel good about themselves despite their constant failure, then that's actually going to be counterproductive. It's going to be basically training the child to not try harder and do more and be successful. So instead of teaching self-esteem and hoping that fixes the child's life, instead you should probably fix the child's life so that they can have a high self-esteem. Lunacy, lunatics, this whole idea that the full moon, when the moon is out and it's full, it can affect people in strange ways. Or maybe if you're born when there's a full moon out, it can affect you in strange ways. You could also talk about the supermoon effect, when a moon is at closest in its orbit that it can get. Like all these moon-related myths are pretty similar in the sense that the whole idea here is somehow that moon can affect your behavior or development. Well, this is mostly false, and this belief has been around since ancient times. Since ancient times, people have believed, for good reasons, that people will act strangely when a full moon is out. Well, their behavior, their acting strangely, is actually the result of the fact that, number one, crimes like violent crimes are committed more often at night, and number two, when the full moon is out, it's easier to see at night. Another myth is that opposites attract. So people who have like opposite interests or opposite personalities or opposite attributes will find each other attractive. It's like magnetism, like electricity, positives and negatives. Well, this is complete fiction. The research on relationships has repeatedly shown that couples that are more similar to each other, so have similar levels of like physical attractiveness, similar levels of intelligence, similar interests, similar hobbies, just basically the more similar they are, the better. So they'll have longer, happier relationships if they have a lot in common. Now, you could trace this back to many different things, but I personally blame Paula Abdul for her song, Opposites Attract. Another one is what I like to call the Little Einstein effect, because there is a kids show called Little Einsteins that seems to be based entirely on this myth. So the myth is that listening to classical music can actually increase your intelligence, or you could expand it. You could just say exposure to like classical music and art and literature can just make you a smarter person. Well, that's completely false. This myth is actually based on a 1993 study that was published in the journal Nature, which is a very reputable journal. And this study showed that college students who listened to 10 seconds of Mozart would show increased spatial reasoning skills. Unfortunately, the study has never really been replicated. Any results we've found trying to replicate the study have been so minuscule, it's pointless. What actually seems to have happened in the study is that listening to that music for 10 seconds just basically made the students more alert and more responsive. It didn't really affect their intelligence, it didn't really affect their judgment, it just made them able to give an answer quicker. Another one that really bothers me, so this myth really kind of irritates me, is the whole idea that some people are left-brained, meaning they're more logically minded, whereas other people are more right-brained, meaning they're more like, emotional, creative, and so on. This does have a tiny bit of truth, but it's mostly false. So in reality, everybody uses both hemispheres all the time. So nobody is going to be on one side or the other. However, some, like certain skills, are processed more so on one side or the other. Like language, for example, is processed more so on the left than the right. But just as a follow-up to that, the brain can adapt. So like if, for example, if you were to lose your left, logical brain, then it's not like you're never going to be able to talk or do math again. It's just going to take your right brain a little while to kind of adapt and learn how to do those kinds of things. So your two hemispheres are basically the same, even though they specialize in slightly different things. Another myth that I like to talk about is the belief that the government is tracking you. The government is watching your movement, watching your purchase, watching your interests, paying attention to who your friends are, and things like that. In reality, this is actually kind of true. This is mostly true. The government and various private businesses do track individuals, largely track their internet activity. So which websites do you go to, what kind of things do you purchase online, that kind of stuff. So there is probably, at this point in your life, there's probably a massive amount of information all about you, what kind of person you are, what kind of interests you have, and so on. So, but I don't want you to feel too paranoid. In reality, even though there's all this data out there, there's quite literally too much data. Like there's so much data that any individual's information is kind of just lost in this massive pile of, pointless data. The only reason why your data would ever potentially be used against you, the only reason why anybody would care about your particular data, is if you are somehow suspected of like some terrible crime or terrorism or something like that. So as long as you're not, a psycho serial killer kind of person, you don't really have much to worry about. Honestly, I could keep talking about these things. I could talk about these things all day long. I could do an entire video series on just myths of psychology. But I actually kind of already have. Over the span of this video series, we're going to talk about many other ones, like the belief that humans are perfectly designed, like there's no flaws with our anatomy, or that dreams hold special and important messages, and alcoholism is just a behavioral problem, it's not like a medical issue. I'll talk about the myth that marijuana is a dangerous drug and punishment doesn't work, and creativity is like an artistic attribute, or that deja vu is the result of recalling memories from a previous life, and so on.